In the 1960s and 70s, underground culture was alive and well, and at the center of it was a mysterious character named Tom Forçade. With me today is Sean Howe. He is the author of the brand new book, Agents of Chaos. Um, Thomas Forçade, High Times, and the Paranoid Era of the 1970s. Uh, Sean, this is a fascinating story, and I think most people's way in might be through High Times because it has such a cultural cachet. But Forçade really, that was kind of the tip of the iceberg. This guy was, uh, well, I mean, you tell me, but he was at the center of all sorts of weird components of underground culture in the 60s and then migrated to politics by the 70s.
Yeah, well, he sort of appeared on the scene out of nowhere in 1969. He
Yeah.
kind of insinuated himself into the top levels of the radical movement and the underground newspaper world. Um, he showed up, and this guy who dressed in all black and didn't like to be photographed, and had a little bit of like a um, negative edge to him that wasn't necessarily par for the course among a lot of the hippie figures who were there. And some people immediately was like, this guy's a cop. So like right from the beginning he was a controversial figure. But he started running something called the Underground Press Syndicate, which was like a consortium of all the underground papers across America, which gave him access to all the power players and some influence in that world. And then he became more and more involved in radical politics. And he was, a very divisive figure in that. He sort of started a feud with Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. And he basically was a contrarian, kind of went against every position anyone else had. The accusations that he was an agent provocateur were sort of rampant in the early 70s. And when he went to the 1972 Republican National Convention, he was arrested. That turned into a firebomb charge. He kind of went underground for a little while, and when he reemerged, it was with High Times, although his name was not in the magazine anywhere.
That opens up so many questions, but let's start with your relationship with Forçade. How did you? It sounds like he really moved through the hippie scene and into the 70s underground. Um, but how did you? He's also remained kind of unsung for almost half a century. How did you discover him and start untangling this weird tale?
Yeah, I have a friend named Jesse Jarno who wrote a great book called Heads, which I think the subtitle is A Psychedelic History of America or something like that. And while he was working on it, I was talking about some of the odder characters in that book. And I started kind of just out of my own curiosity, kind of researching some of those people on my own. Tom Forçade was not one of those people that came out of those conversations, but the research that I did, this kind of compulsive rabbit hole, no project in mind, that led me to Tom Forçade. And I was like, here's a guy who is involved, not only in the radical politics world and the journalism world, but also he somehow popped up in like the punk movement, and he popped up in the drug smuggling world. And it just seemed like it was, this thread you kept pulling, and it kept going. And I was like, why haven't I ever heard of this? Why hasn't any? I mean, among I guess students of the counterculture, they know his name, and certainly High Times magazine has celebrated his life, retrospectively. Although, his name didn't appear in the magazine while he was alive. Um, but the fact that someone could be this Zelig figure and that, you know, no one had ever heard of him, I had to like kind of keep digging. It was just, I guess, a little bit of an obsession.
You kind of address this in the book, but maybe you can tease it out for me. This is a period of time. The cultural revolution that happened between the 60s and the 70s is a period of time of, there was a cultural explosion that still kind of dominates a lot of music and movies and our culture today. But it's a period of time that was really almost over indexed and over reported. How did he stay so discreet, so truly underground for so long, and yet have such an impact on the culture?
Yeah, the funny thing is there was a brief period of time in the early 70s where I think he wanted the kind of the fame and glory and influence that the some of the figure, the I guess the term that some of these people used was movement heavies. Those were the guys like Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, John Sinclair of the White Panthers. These guys who had like kind of cults of personality around them. And Forçade kind of chased that for a little while. And in 1971 and 1972, it seemed like he was doing everything he could to get his like name in the papers and get, he started an offshoot of the Yippies that he called the Zippies. And, they were kind of going for media attention at all times. And I think it was after this arrest that he just kind of started really covering his tracks again. And, I guess High Times really, that's the obvious legacy that you can point to. High Times back in the mid 70s was kind of like along the lines of like Rolling Stone or Playboy, and that they had, serious interviews with serious figures. There's a great Susan Sontag interview in one issue. Gil Scott Heron is interviewed, and that a lot of the more traditional counterculture figures you might imagine pop up as well. But it was selling like maybe a third of a million copies every issue, and that kind of that influx of money and notoriety also allowed it to pour money into drug lobby organizations. And I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize today is that drug legalization really had a lot of steam back in 1976, 77, 78. And High Times was kind of right, at the center of that. And a lot of states began decriminalizing, and people fully expected that Jimmy Carter was going to legalize marijuana. For a variety of reasons that I get into in the book, that didn't happen. But certainly, the ball that it started rolling, is what you see today.
I would imagine with that type of context, he could see launching something like High Times as being analogous to maybe Rolling Stone or something. If Carter wins a second term and legalizes marijuana, and he is the publisher of High Times, I would imagine that's a pretty lucrative business opportunity as well.
Yeah, and near the end of his life, he was trying to get into movies. He saw like, oh, there's National Lampoon's Animal House is making tons of money, and Cheech and Chong are making tons of money. Up in Smoke had come out, and he thought, well, what if you combine a magazine's kind of franchise like National Lampoon and a drug movie? Like, this is a no-brainer. I think one thing that was really a bummer for him, back in 1978 was he went out to Los Angeles and showed a cut of a movie he was involved in to Robert Evans. And Robert Evans was like, this is trash. He just wanted like Forçade's connections to like liquid cocaine. And so that really kind of put Forçade in one of his his periodic funks.
Um, Chuck Klosterman kind of alluded to this in his blurb for your book, but monetizing the underground cultures, um, plural, uh, seems like such a like or he seems like such a metaphor for doing that, taking counterculture and the Cultural Revolution and punk rock, and then uh, making money off of it. It seems like, I mean, is he a metaphor for that practice, that idea?
I think in a way he's kind of an imperfect metaphor only because he had such well maybe this is what makes him a perfect metaphor. He had such a fraught relationship with
Yeah,
the concept of selling out. So
yeah,
he really railed against it, in the early 70s. And that was one of the things that he took people like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin to task for. He said, these guys are making too much money. Um, they are selling out the people. And then with High Times, I think, there was maybe a desire to subvert, this capitalist world from within. And I think one of the things that kind of emerges in the story is that it's really tough to like beat capitalism at its own game. And so he was very, I think, at times when High Times would become successful, he would every once in a while want to pull the plug on it. He thought it was like no longer true to its values. So that kind of dichotomy was always a big thing for him.
and that dichotomy has wrapped itself around the idea of underground and punk rock plus the antithesis of selling out, or having an antipathy for selling out, and at the same time monetizing counterculture is such it is a thing that has happened from the 60s until today. You won an Eisner Award for your book Marvel Comics: The Untold Story, which also kind of chronicles this period of the 60s and 70s. Is there something about this particular era that you find interesting?
Yeah, yes, I think uh, for whatever reason, I think the time before I came into the world, and then the time when I was, not really, so cognizant of the outside world. I think I don't know. I guess it's like trying to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true for other people. But, the stuff that came out right before they were born, the records or the movies has like a weird special pull for them. But it's also just objectively, undeniably, I think a really fascinating time in American history, particularly as relates to politics and drugs.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, it's also, do you think there's something to this? Was one of the last pre-digital eras, and especially it was an era of cultural, like a cultural renaissance, but before our hyper-connected reality that we experience now. Do you think there's some kind of maybe a nostalgia for this period, or there is a desire to, I mean, this really was underground culture. You had to seek it out. You had to find the records or the books or the magazines that spoke to you. Do you think that there's some kind of nostalgia for this period of time?
Well, I'm a naturally nostalgic person, so for me,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes, I have a nostalgia for this period of time in the 80s and the 90s, and uh, you know, pretty much the 20th century. Um, it seems like it used to be that like nostalgia operated on like 20-year cycles, and I guess now it's all it's all sort of you know, splayed out in a a weird way. Like teenagers are like, wearing Nirvana shirts and, maybe uh like bell bottom pants, and it's all like in a blender. Um
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I think maybe people my age are a little, especially people my age who don't have kids, are maybe a little oblivious as to how it bubbles up with younger generations. I'm always shocked when like some like obscure R&B song from the 1970s becomes like a TikTok song, and like this little corner that I thought I had some kind of like proprietary hold on is just like zeitgeist currency. Um, but yeah, I do think the 70s has been I think there's been a nostalgic interest in the 70s, at least since the early 90s. And I think there's also something I couldn't help but think, working on this book, there's kind of this rise and fall arc that you know gets sort of overlaid on the 1970s, and it's always like things are good, and then everyone starts doing cocaine, and then everything goes bad. It's like Goodfellas and Boogie Nights, and it was hard not to think about that when the kind of amount, the number of like guns that started showing up, and the number of harder drugs that started showing up as the 70s drew to a close. um, I think for whatever reason that also really appeals to people. I think that's almost become like a cliche in kind of
Right. Yeah.
like these kind of Tarantino, Elmore Leonard stories, where you've got like a lot of guns and like cool sedans and a good soundtrack. you know
Um, so you've been working on this for nearly a decade. Um, but and in fact, you just referenced it. I was going to ask, like, when
yeah.
you were researching and reporting this, and when you were drafting the copy, what was your soundtrack?
Well, I guess uh I guess everything that you might listen to over a period of like 8 years was, you
So
know,
nothing that was specific to that period of time.
I listened. I did listen to, when I was, there's a lot of flashback stuff, and I think there's kind of a turning point in Forçade's life in Phoenix in the mid '60s, and so I was listening to, I guess, a lot of like whatever I thought would be on the radio in Arizona in 1967. I was listening to a lot of kind of like regional hits, and it's not quite classic rock. It's a little more like sunshine AM pop stuff. Um, and then I also knew some of the stuff that Forçade listened to himself. So like, there are stories of him he had this proto dispensary, like called it a smokeasy, and there's this story of him like working behind the counter and blasting Derek and the Dominoes, Key to the Highway, like over and over again. Um, so um, so I listen to all those kinds of things just to try to like get into that a little bit.
All right. So what's next? What's the next story? Do you have one yet?
I've honestly been spending the summer trying to just like read on a hammock in my backyard as much as possible, and I honestly like have no idea what I might be writing next. I felt like I owed myself a summer. This book really took me in in different directions that I didn't expect, but
Well,
I really think it'll this was supposed to be after the Marvel book. This was supposed to be something that was like a little easier,
A
something.
chaser.
You know, so I'm definitely going to tread carefully as I choose my next project.
Well, Sean Howe is the author of Agents of Chaos, Thomas King Forçade, High Times, and the Paranoid Era of the 1970s. You can pre-order it on digital book retailers, but you can also get it in your local bookstore.